Juneteenth is now a national holiday. In fact, it's the 12th, having been passed, that is made a holiday by by the Congress. So it's a really wonderful, about time tribute, and we're just sorry we can't all celebrate in person, but Juneteenth 2022 is going to be in person, so we should all plan to be there. And our tribute to Juneteenth from LWVBAE is on the website, a story about the wonderful exhibit on African Americans in Berkeley by the Berkeley Historical Society. And, you know, you can visit this exhibit online, but of course it's much nicer to go there in person. The only thing is it's Thursday, Friday, Saturday, 1 to 4. So the hours are limited, but you know, if you have a chance, it's right near the BART station, of course, next to the City Hall Park. So it's a great, really a great treasure of particularly black and white photos from about post World War II to close to the present, of prominent and just, you know, everyday African Americans from the south side of Berkeley. So really, I urge you to see that wonderful exhibit. Okay, Adina, are you ready to?
Yes,
Okay,
definitely ready.
great.
Thanks, Ruby.
You're welcome.
Well, hello, everyone. Welcome. I think we are recording, just to let you know. So if you don't want your face in the recording, you can definitely turn off your video, but only if you want to. We love seeing your faces. I'd like to ask that I have our panelists pinned, if that's possible, or spotlighted so that we can focus on all of them. And hopefully that will happen soon. Thank you so much to Cynthia and Candia who are doing our tech. I don't know if I'm missing somebody else, but appreciate that very much in this Zoom world. My name is Adina Ishii. For those of you that don't know me, I am currently the Voter Services Director on the League Board. And actually, I forgot, just Sunday, elected to the State Board as well. So I'm very excited about that opportunity. I'm also a past president. I think that many of you have been League members for a long time, but for those of you that are new to us, we are a nonpartisan political organization of women and men who fight to make democracy work, or defend democracy, as we say now. And that looks like voter registration, education, and advocacy on a variety of different issues. Now, I think that our local league has not been as involved in housing in more recent years and working to get more involved. And so this is really kind of an opportunity for us to do that. This panel is focused on the structural inequity around housing and how the COVID-19 pandemic has exacerbated this issue. Our league and leagues around the country have committed to diversity, equity, and inclusion, and using this lens throughout all of our work. And housing has been a particularly hot button issue that is really shaped by the inequity in our current systems. So that's really kind of the impetus for having this presentation today. I think I just got muted, but just like we have had in the past, we will have some prepared questions that we have for our panelists, and then we will ask some questions from the audience. And so if you could put in your comments into the comment box in the chat, they will get put into a document for me, and then I will look it over and pull out questions. Elisa, am I correct? Yes, she's shaking her head, yes. And I wasn't sure, I would still love to have everybody pinned, if that's possible, or spotlit. I'm not sure where our host went, but in any case, I would love to just introduce our panelists and just start right there. And then I think I would like to start with Xavier, because I can see your little box. If you could just give us like a minute or so introduction of who you are and kind of your work that's related to this topic.
I really am in such a crazy mental space right now. There are so many things going on today with I feel like my mind is just blown right now, but I've had the privilege of living in so many states in this country: Michigan, Florida, North Carolina, Connecticut, Texas, and now California. And I feel like I've been in Berkeley long enough now to see that literally, I realize now MLK Jr. Street is the street where redlining is. That is actually the street where the redlining line ends. And I did not make that connection until today. And I feel like, to me, that just demonstrates the importance of understanding a history, understanding the place that you're in, understanding the culture behind it, understanding the space, the land that we occupy, and being cognizant of that, and starting conversations with people and starting discussions and participating in groups with our community together. And the more and more I continue to be involved in spaces, the more and more I've moved around, the more and more I see the issues are really the same and they have the same core issue. And yeah, and I appreciate being able to be here in conversation with all of you, because quite frankly, particularly now as an elected official more so than ever, I see the importance of it being a two-way street and a two-way conversation. Even though I do feel like that's always been my motto, particularly today, I feel like I need that two-way street in my community. So I thank you all.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining us. And next, let's have Erin Baldassari. You are next in my little boxes.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for having me. I'm Erin Baldassari. I'm the one of the housing affordability reporters at KQED. We write about homelessness, rental security, zoning issues, state policy. It really runs the gamut. In the fall of last year, my colleague Molly Solomon and I produced a podcast called Sold Out: Rethinking Housing in America. So just a shameless plug to go and give it a listen. It's 6 episodes long. You can find it on Spotify or iTunes or on KQED's website. And we have a 2nd season coming out this fall. So it's a good time to refresh. We did actually even do an episode looking at some of the racist history of land policies in Berkeley. So definitely has some local ramifications as well.
Yeah, thank you so much. We're getting a question in the chat. What's the name of the podcast again? So maybe you can throw it in, and maybe even a link. And also a note from Greg that says it's very good. So with lots of R's. And next, if I can have an introduction by Shajuti Hossain.
Yes, hi everyone, I'm Shajuti Hossain. I'm a staff attorney at Public Advocates, which is a legal nonprofit advocacy organization based in San Francisco. And my work has primarily focused on regional housing planning in the Bay Area. So I'll be sharing a little bit about my work and what I've been learning and working on with you all, and I'm really excited to be here, so thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining us. And last but not least, Carol Galante.
Hi everyone, I'm Carol Galante, and I am a professor at UC Berkeley in the Department of City and Regional Planning, and been there about 6 years. And I started a center called the Terner Center for Housing Innovation when I came, that really looks at, we like to call it an action tank as opposed to a think tank, where we really try to research and then put out educational material that can influence public policy and changes in our structures. And so that's what I've been doing for 6 years. I also have a long, which I won't go through my whole bio because I'm old, but I have a long history in developing both affordable mixed income housing and working at the local governmental level early in my career, and with the Obama administration right before I came to Berkeley for 6 years. So happy to be here.
Thank you so much for coming. I really love our mix of folks. I'm really excited to hear from all of your different experiences. You all have a wealth of knowledge. And what I want to start with is just kind of, our prepared questions, of course, but we're really starting with an assumption of inequity. So I think it's really important that in our first question, we set the scene for that. So Carol has actually prepared a couple of slides just to show us some basic information to start with. And if Carol, you could kind of help set the scene for what's kind of been going on, that would be really great. And I will ask.
Sure. I'll start talking, and then I think someone else is going to get the slides up. But what I really wanted to articulate, and it really goes to the title of this, look, the housing problem and the many aspects of it long precede the pandemic. But really the pandemic, I think, along with, frankly, the George Floyd murder really did just put a spotlight on those inequities and the implications for not just housing, but for how we all live. But two of the slides I wanted to just show to really bring this home is one of the questions I keep getting, particularly as the pandemic kind of unwinds, is, are we still going to have a housing affordability problem in the Bay Area once everybody's, working remotely? And so I like to show this just to make clear that not everybody can work remotely, not on a long shot, and that the people who are most impacted by the inability to work remotely from their homes are people at the lower educational levels. They have jobs, service jobs, that require them to be at a place of work, and they require and it requires them to be at a place that is close to their work. Otherwise, their quality of life in terms of their commutes, etc., health, all of that is just compromised. So that's one thing I wanted to show. The other is just that the pandemic, if we could show the next one, the pandemic really has, this just shows that people at the lowest income end of the spectrum have been what we call cost burdened. So if you earn less than 30% of the median income, you've been cost burdened well before the pandemic. And that's because you don't have enough income coming in to pay the very high costs of housing, particularly in a place like the Bay Area. One of the things that the pandemic showed is that there are a lot of people, even up the income spectrum, who can't, survive the housing crisis with, the kind of disruption that an unemployment crisis brings in a place like the Bay Area. And so you're seeing in this slide newly burdened people as a result of the pandemic. And the fact is, again, just back to the other slide, that those inequities, hit Black and brown people at a much greater pace. Both the unemployment rate, the rent burdens, all of these slides, can definitely show an inequality that goes along racial lines. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Carol. I appreciate you, giving us that overview and bringing up these very important pieces. And I'd like to also kind of open this to other folks. If you can also share with us how you saw housing in the Bay Area pre-pandemic, and kind of how have you seen the impacts of the pandemic? I know that's kind of like the whole thing we're talking about, but I would be curious to see, because I feel like we're sort of addressing both right now.
I mean, California was in a housing crisis before the pandemic. It was the crisis in California before the pandemic. I mean, the governor's State of the State address in 2020, right before the pandemic hit, was all centered on homelessness. California at that time had 151,000, more than 151,000 people experiencing homelessness. That's a quarter of the nation's homeless population. It's half of its unsheltered population. And at the latest count, that number was 10,000 higher. So, you know, at the same time, we haven't seen housing prices go down. I mean, if anything, housing prices have only gone up, and they've gone up crazily. I mean, we're at a time of historically high prices for housing, record low inventory. Houses, 70% of the houses that sold in May were above asking price. And so I think what that shows is really the unevenness of how the pandemic has impacted lower income folks versus, as Carol said, the people who can work remotely and who weren't really impacted as much. And so it's definitely something that we're paying attention to at the housing desk at KQED, and thinking very closely about is the precarity of particularly lower income renters who are only seeing their rents go higher, especially in areas like suburbs that were sort of more affordable before the pandemic and now have seen a lot more demand. And so it's really impacting people very differently depending on your income, your job.
So I think I kind of want to add in a conversation about redlining here. I think when we look at so I have kind of two different perspectives. One as a rent board member, one as a person who just lives in the city of Berkeley, and one as, I guess, three as a tenants' rights attorney. So the rent board actually, because units are registered, we get to see, and they have to register what their initial rent is when people move in. We get to see the numbers and track the changes of what the rents actually are with units registered with the rent board. And actually, for most of the unit types, the rents have gone down for parts of the pandemic. But why is it going down? It's because people are moving out of the city of Berkeley and aren't actually trying to use the housing here. So the crisis is not actually a housing crisis. It's a political crisis of not investing enough money to house people. I would propose that as a counterpoint, that really the solution is not so much like, we can solve the problem. We've always had the capacity to solve the problem. We just don't invest the resources to solve the problem. And so on a flip side of that, I think, where else was I going with that? Again, I'm still like 1,000 different places, but I also think, I think specifically, so I'm wearing an East Bay Stonewall Democratic Club shirt because it's also Pride Month, and so I'm not just Black, I'm also queer. And I think a lot of places are talking about how do we get money to fund all these things that we believe in? How do we get all these money to fund all the liberal causes that we believe in? And I think what people also forget about what Pride was originally, it was Black and brown queer people who were policed or over-policed, who were harmed, who literally rioted. It was called a Stonewall riot, and then it turned into Pride somehow. I don't know how that happened, but it was the Stonewall riot where literally they fought back. They said no. They said, we're tired of you policing our communities. They said, we're tired of you fighting against us. We said, we're tired of you doing everything you've done historically to us, and we're not going to stand for it anymore. And so to me now, it's crazy because I feel like we're standing in the same moment that we were in for the entire history of this country. Yeah. You
were going to say something about redlining. I wanted to give you an opportunity to chat about that, but we can also talk about that later if you want.
That's part of it, is that so what was redlining? How did we have housing discrimination? What is the idea of that? It's the idea that there was not access to credit, there wasn't access to money, there wasn't access to job opportunities that allow people to be able to pay for housing in different parts of our communities. And that's the same situation we have right now in the city of Berkeley. I can't afford a house here. I will never probably be able to afford a house here. That's just the reality of it. I'm going to be a renter forever, probably, especially if unless the only way I could maybe buy a home is if I went to a big law firm and made a bunch of money and did the most horribly heinous, morally bankrupt things I could possibly do. I don't want to do that. So I'm just going to be a renter, I guess. And I feel, as I say this in my Stonewall shirt, there's so many in my queer communities of color spaces, Jewish spaces, so many people who are in that same situation. Well, we're fighting for renters' rights because we're not going to be able to own. So that's where we're at.
That actually segues perfectly into the conversation Shajuti and I were having earlier, so go ahead.
Yeah, so I'd like to build off of what Xavier was saying because, yeah, in addition to redlining, because of redlining and other factors, now you see that the Bay Area is actually more racially segregated today than it was in 1970. And that's research from UC Berkeley, but impacted communities have known that. The research just kind of confirms it and agrees with it, but people who have been impacted by it have been pushed out of the region, priced out of the region, have already known that. And it comes from, profit-driven government decisions that have perpetuated racial segregation, whether it's by failing to address the fact that housing costs are rising much faster than incomes, or failing to hold landlords accountable if they're discriminating or harassing or neglecting their tenants. So for all these reasons and more, we're now seeing this, increased racial segregation. And of course, we can think of a lot of problems of associated with segregation, but one of them is that it allows governments and real estate interests to hoard public resources in predominantly wealthy and white communities while underinvesting in lower income communities of color. And so that's what you saw in the pandemic, is that already lower income communities are working at high risk jobs, not getting paid enough for all the health risks they're taking every day, and then not having enough money to pay for a stable home. So maybe they're living in a crowded condition where it's hard to quarantine, or they don't have enough money to pay for healthcare or preventative measures for any underlying conditions they have. So all of that making them more susceptible to COVID. So while, facing job loss and death and illness in their families or to themselves, now we're seeing, the state starting to open up, but at the same time, it's going to take probably years for the most impacted residents to really get back on their feet. And of course, the system was already broken. And so I think right now is the time for local, regional, state, federal, all levels of government to really be working together to come up with solutions. These problems are happening because of explicit decisions that were made, often driven by profits. And so this time we need decisions to be made driven by the most impacted residents.
Thank you for really tying in, I think, what everyone had been saying. I think that's really perfect. And really, again, grateful for all of your perspectives. And I think that, something I would like to hear about, because you are all doing work in this area, either reporting on it or out in the field or research or all of the above. And I'd like to hear a little bit about, I know we're going off script, but I would like to hear a little bit about what you all are doing to address these impacts, these things that are going on in your work. And we can start with whoever wants to start.
Maybe if you don't mind if I jump in, because I want to kind of go back to the question of what was it like pre-pandemic and why, and what do we do about it? And I think the issue that's come up, that this is an income problem, is absolutely true. So wages have not kept up with housing prices. So that is absolutely true. And at the same time, the rise in housing costs is driven, I think people, so housing costs have risen much, much exponentially higher than incomes. And the question is, well, why has that happened? And some of that is, speculation and profits, but some of that is the regulatory environment and the actual cost of production, and who pays for that cost of production, what kind of capital goes into producing a single family home or a rental home. And, just as an example, I built dedicated affordable housing, and that same housing today can cost, in the Bay Area, $700,000 or $800,000, maybe more per unit to produce. So that's not profit. And that is a problem that we also need to tackle. So we're not building enough housing at a cost-effective manner, and that cost effectiveness comes from a broken construction industry system. It also comes from a regulatory system, and I'm just going to go to one of the key issues in California, which is Prop 13. So property taxes don't rise very much. Everybody who owns a home loves that, and I get that. But at the same time, then governments are charging new development all kinds of fees to make their public budgets work, where if they were increasing property taxes, that cost would be spread amongst everybody. And those are real barriers to getting to more balance between, yes, we need to increase incomes. Yes, but we also need to build more housing. Yes, we need to think about how do we control the speculative capital that is coming into real estate. Like all three of those things need to be addressed. And just one last thing on the regulatory environment, because we were chatting in our breakout room. You know, the exclusionary zoning is part of that. The, you know, density restrictions are part of that. Parking requirements are part of that. Costs $65,000 to park a car under a concrete podium. That's how much it costs to build that parking space. And that's going to a car, not to a person.
Thank you, Carol. I think Xavier, you're gonna hop in.
Yeah, I would, I agree with all of that. I think the piece that I would add is, how do we solve redlining? I think, like, how do we solve the fact that there's this inequality in these two different parts of our city? And I think the answer to that is simple. Like, you have a lot of wealth in one part of the city, and you have a lack of opportunity and wealth in the other. Like, I feel like we just passed policies that allow us to tax the properties that have historically benefited from redlining, that have benefited from a history of racism across many different community types. Racism, like, I mean, I think back, like, I've been reflecting a lot on, like, when I came to that realization that, like, that literally the road of redlining is, like, named after Martin Luther King Jr. It made me reflect on, like, okay, like, what did he speak? Also, the fact that we have, like that is Juneteenth, that we're, like, talking about these days, like, freedom and, like, coming to a time where we've had solution to these things. And I reflect on it, and I'm just looking at, like, okay, like, the core of the Fair Housing Act, like, they wanted, like, public funding for these things. They wanted us to invest our dollars as a community into providing the basic necessities that we all as human beings inherently have to use. Like, why do we rely on markets for this? Like, what is the point? Like, there is no point. A market is never going to give housing to people because it wants to profit, not house. And so, like, the more and more I think about it, the more it's just, to me, and I think that, like, this is another thing. I feel like I've never also truly understood the purpose of a land acknowledgement before, because I think that the reality is that we are occupying space that has been taken over by ancestors, by many people's ancestors, and I think that it's important to, so I just want to put that out there. I think it's important to do, and to recognize that really all these issues, it's not just here, it's kind of a global conflict. I just think, like, if humanity just took all the money we spend on, like, bombs and like weapons and guns and all these other things and just invested it in, like, providing basic resources to our people, like, what more could we do if we were not focused on, I'm sorry, I'm going on a tangent, I'm gonna stop.
I mean, I think to your point, Xavier, you know, one of the things that we did see during the pandemic, particularly as it related to homelessness, was that for the first time, there was some political will and the resources to house people quickly. So, you know, the state put 23,000 people into hotel rooms very quickly as the pandemic was ramping up, and then turned about 6,000, created about 6,000 units of permanent housing. It's a drop in the bucket for the 161,000 people experiencing homelessness on any given night in California, but it still represented the single largest expansion of homeless housing in the state's history. And, you know, we're talking, you know, the governor has proposed more than doubling down, you know, a $7 billion expansion of that program. We have federal dollars aligned with state dollars for the first time. I mean, in terms of policies for investing in housing and homelessness. And so it does seem like there's an opportunity to really put your money where your mouth is and not have the excuse of scarcity to limit what can be done with these public dollars in terms of, you know, can we get more money for acquisitions, for community land trusts and affordable housing nonprofits to reclaim some of that land, right? Some of the home key dollars went to Native tribes in Northern California. Can we see more repatriation, you know, for landless tribes in particular who lost, you know, some of whom lost their tribal status from the federal government, which is a whole other issue I don't want to get into. You know, but how do we use some of this money to reclaim spaces for people of color who have been disenfranchised from the ability to own homes or to claim land?
Yeah, I'd like to add a little bit more about, what the opportunities are right now and how like local elected officials can really make a difference at this time. And you all too. I think what's happening right now is a state-mandated local housing planning process in the Bay Area, where basically every city and county has to plan for projected housing growth across basically the next 8 years. So this is a really great opportunity for all of you to be engaging with your local elected officials and telling them that you want to see more affordable housing and housing justice in your communities. Because now, especially now, it's important because the Fair Housing Act, which was a federal law, is now also state law in California. And these local housing plans called housing elements are legally required to actively address racial segregation, its harmful effects, and ensure housing justice in our housing systems moving forward. And I think it's really important to keep in mind that there are really two main components of this that need to go into all of these housing plans. One is that there needs to be more investment in existing neighborhoods of color, the lower income, disproportionately people of color neighborhoods, where they need more resources that are particular to them and that would help them stay there if they choose. And then the second component is to provide more affordable home options in places that have historically excluded them so that people can move there if they choose, especially based on, if they work there or they go to school there or have healthcare in those areas. So I think I just want to emphasize that both of those pieces are really necessary for our local and regional housing plans to truly address racial segregation. And it is possible. And I think now is the time for our elected officials to hear from all of you to say that you want housing justice in your community, because there's going to be plenty of people who are fighting to maintain the status quo. And clearly the status quo has not been working. So if you want to get involved, you can let me know. I can drop my email in the chat. But there's also an organization in the East Bay called East Bay Housing Organizations that advocates for affordable housing in Alameda and Contra Costa counties. So I can put their link in the chat as well if you want to get on their mailing list.
I think, something just to follow up with what Shajuti was saying and what Xavier was saying about the market not solving everything, as we think about density, as we think about eliminating exclusionary zoning, it's not an either or, it's a yes and. It requires also investing in affordable housing and in making sure that we site that affordable housing in high opportunity neighborhoods and protecting tenants and ensuring that there isn't displacement and gentrification to go along with it. There's no way to separate those policies. They have to be done in tandem.
I agree with that, Erin. I also, I think one of the other important things to understand is we have, as a country, which is very different than many other countries, a situation that we created, back to Xavier's point with the redlining, where the market together with the public sector did solve the housing problem for the vast majority of white families in this country. Okay, my parents are an example of that. My father did not have a high school education. He had a working job. He came out of the Navy and was able to buy a house with 1% down through the GI Bill. Okay, if he had been Black, he would not have been able to do that. And the government financed the roads, the government financed the sewers, the water, everything that was needed for that developer to build out the suburbs as we know them today. So it wasn't just market forces, it was governmental action that enabled every person who bought a house in 1955, they were subsidized by the federal government. And make no mistake about it. And so the one thing I would say is I don't think we're going to get rid of a predominantly homeownership society in the United States of America. Not in my lifetime, which I know my lifetime is getting shorter by the minute. But so I do think we need to be focused on solutions where the government is investing to make housing more affordable for everybody, and may need to make special actions to ensure that people, Black people, brown people who were excluded from the equity development opportunities that white families had, that there is a redressing of that problem to put people more on an equal footing to get credit and to be able to own a home. So I really, I am one who doesn't believe we should give up on having, an equitable home ownership society. And not that there's lots of people that want to rent, need to rent. That's great. But I wouldn't want to give up on home ownership.
Thank you. But I'm going to jump in here because we've kind of gone off the track a little bit in terms of we're talking about housing and all these issues, which is totally true. But turning us back to the pandemic, what are some issues that are going to happen, as a result of the pandemic? It's put extra pressure. We've talked about that on this situation, but what are some concerns that folks have, about the impacts of COVID?
Well, I'll just jump in and then I'll be quiet. That the big issue that I see is we've got a huge amount of emergency rental assistance coming out of the federal government and out of the state and local governments. It's not getting out fast enough. It's not getting to the most vulnerable people. We don't have so it's just like the vaccines were, right? We don't have an implementation system that is distributing those emergency resources equitably. And that, and I think the state is starting to take some measures to fix some of that in California, which I see as progress. Because if we don't fix that, we have most of these folks live in small buildings. They don't live in those 200 unit luxury apartment complexes, right? They live in small buildings, many of them owned by people of color, by the way, who own a 2-plex or a 4-plex.
Carol, yeah. I think I'm going to interrupt you just because Xavier works for an organization that has been helping to distribute that. And I'd be interested in hearing kind of what you have to say. I also see, I don't know if Erin, you were unmuting to speak or just to...
I'm just glad that Carol brought that up because, the stats that we're seeing from the state's rent relief program is about 5% of the people who've completed applications have received rent relief as of yesterday. The moratorium on evictions is set to expire at the end of this month. That's not to say that I know the Berkeley and other cities have some local rent relief programs. So I don't have data on the local ones, but of the applications that the state has received, including incomplete applications, it's the amount that's been applied for is only about 1/3 of the amount that's available. So we know, I'm looking at a dashboard right now from the National Equity Atlas that estimates there's $3.5 billion in total rent debt right now in California, and 758,000 households that are behind on rent. The state portion, which is about half of the rent relief going out, they've only received about 190 applications. So we know that it is definitely not, the program is not reaching everyone.
So I'm kind of scared to say this because of the knowledge implications for other people, but the reality is that Alameda County has the best moratorium in the entire state of California. Alameda County's moratorium has 3 exceptions as well, though. So there are 3 instances where people can still be evicted. I'm not going to say what those are on this phone call because if there's a landlord here who hears it, they will learn it and then they'll use it against their tenants. But those exceptions, when they do know that they exist, every property owner continue, because they're so upset that they're not getting money right now, they continue to reframe any instance as close as possible to what those exceptions are. So, and the reality is that right now, they passed a new law recently that makes it so there's some obligation of the owners to accept some of the money for rental assistance, but that came how many months after the pandemic started? I've been negotiating situations with clients since then who've experienced harassment since the pandemic began because the landlords are pissed off that they're not getting money. I've experienced clients who have, even though they wanted to stay, they just don't want to deal with that much debt. Do they have to pay? Like, are they going to, their income's not going to go up anymore. It's not like they're getting like extra opportunities to make more money. So tacking on a bunch of debt that they have to pay for down the road isn't going to solve the problem. And I really do thank the League of Women Voters for the information that you do, because the last time I was here, someone asked me a question about like I was talking about just rental forgiveness and like who has the authority to pass that. And someone asked me like, oh, like, well, what do you work? Or someone asked like, what are you working on locally? And I was like, it's a good question. And it made me reflect on like, all I knew actually was what the council members were telling me about rental forgiveness and what their legal authority was and was not. All I knew was them saying that like, oh, we can't do that for X, Y, and Z reason. That being said, I also wasn't in conversation with the tenants' rights advocates who are doing a lot of the work locally too. And so I think for me, what we need to do is really like reevaluate, like, what does this look like specifically in Berkeley? But I think the reality of it is that we did the pandemic wrong. We should have provided the money up front to people at the beginning. We should have said that you cannot be evicted if you can't pay rent and you don't have to owe this money. Can't change that now, but we can think of what we can do moving forward.
It's interesting you say that. I actually spoke to a landlord who said the same thing. He's about $200,000 in, he took about $200,000 out of his own savings to cover tenants, expenses because tenants weren't paying rent. And he says the exact same thing, that, the government should have just started giving people money right away when they couldn't pay rent instead of the system that we have. Of course, part of the reason we have this rent relief program was the second stimulus bill that was passed. So there was some funding to make it happen.
Is there anything you want to add, Shajuti? I know you didn't get into that one as much.
Yeah, I mean, I can just add that, as Carol was saying earlier, that like a statewide eviction moratorium is expiring in a couple of weeks, or I think Erin or Carol, I can't remember who said that. But that is a really daunting, because I think, as everyone has mentioned already, no one has the income to make up for all that rent right now. And so apparently the state lawmakers have signaled that there may be some kind of extension of the moratorium, but we haven't seen any of the details yet, so we're not sure what it's going to look like. But we are repeatedly reminding them that it's essential that the moratorium is extended, because no one is able to recover that quickly. Like we need time, and we need longer term policies that are going to make sure that everyone has a stable home.
Thank you so much. We are supposed to move into our audience questions. I know there's so much to speak about here and we could talk forever. One thing I wanted to just make a comment about, someone asked about this. So legal redlining is no longer allowed. However, the situations continue to perpetuate what is happening. And so I just want to clarify that. There was a question about that. And then right here, the question says, okay. Sorry.
Can I add something to that, Adina?
Yes,
although
please.
Redlining is illegal, there's been some great reporting at Reveal that looks at it was a Pulitzer Prize. They were finalists for the Pulitzer Prize and looked at modern day redlining, with banks basically giving people of color less favorable terms than white counterparts, based on, we're talking about identical qualifications. And, there's lots of evidence. There's a story, I think NBC Bay Area, someone did a couple months ago, that looked at appraisals for houses. Black family in Marin, their home was appraised at a much, much lower rate, a lower price than they did a second appraisal, like a week later, with a white person pretending to be the homeowner. And it was insane, the price difference. So, although redlining is illegal, discrimination still happens, and it still very much influences the housing market.
Thanks for adding on. Okay, so I have some questions and some comments. So I'm going to stick with the questions that are actually questions, because that's what we do with the League. So this one says, what is happening now with folks that were unhoused during the pandemic and then were housed temporarily? Do we have any stats about how many of these folks will go into permanent housing? Erin, I think you actually did a story about this, I read. I believe.
Did do a story back in November. At that time, it looked like the hotels were going to close and we're starting to wrap up by the end of the year because they were initially funded through FEMA, and actually still are being funded through FEMA, but it looked like the FEMA money was going to end at the end of last year when, after Biden was inaugurated, he announced that they would continue funding through September and they would actually fund 100% of the, they're called shelter-in-place hotels. And so I do not have updated data on how many people have exited those spaces into permanent housing because it's not being centrally, the state isn't collecting that data centrally. So you have to go to each county and agency to ask them how many people have moved into permanent housing. But I think that San Francisco has committed to ensuring that 100% of its residents are moving into housing. Alameda County had a press release out maybe a month or two ago, like a month ago, I think I want to say, that said about 60% of the residents went on to permanent housing. Some people resolve their housing situations in other ways. If they move on to family, they go into a drug rehab program. They, have other avenues where they might leave and not enter another permanent housing program. But I think there's a reason to be more optimistic than we were last November when we were seeing a very small percentage, I think it was about 15% of people moving into permanent housing. I think those numbers have increased as the hotels have been open longer. And again, some of these sites have been turned into permanent housing. So there's 94 sites throughout the state, not just hotels and motels, but also tiny homes and apartment buildings and some single family homes and modular housing that have been created as a result of the state's program to build more permanent housing, and $7 billion proposed for over the next 2 years.
Thank you for that. I like how you're like, I have no data, but I have all this other data. Anyone else have any comments about that? I don't know if anyone else knows.
That was to the data question, right?
Yeah, it was the question around folks who were unhoused during the pandemic were put into these, into housing. How many of them got into permanent housing? What's going to happen?
I saw the other question coming up about details on those who are applying for rent relief, and that's deep within the wheelhouse of Centro, but I didn't have a time to pull the statistics before here today, so I don't have it for you right now, but I'll give a follow-up email with that like I did the last time I was here,
okay.
What those statistics are.
That would be great. I would be really interested to see more about who is applying for rent relief as a separate statistics topic. We are very stats and data oriented here. It's very, it's definitely something
I will drop something in the chat with some state data that we just got. It's like an infographic, so I can't recite the numbers, but you all can look at it.
Yeah, thank you. And just for folks who are on the call, I will make sure that we get these links to you so that you don't have to farm them out of here. I know we've got a lot of comments. Let's see. So there are comments in the chat right now about property tax exemptions and rebates for owner occupants and renter occupants with low incomes. Do folks want to comment on that at all? I know that Preston has been writing lots about that.
So there's a lot here in the chat to read through, so I'm not sure I understood the question. I mean, if there is a provision of state law that if a property is deed restricted to serve low income and the resident qualifies as low income, that the county assessor, and there's a managing partner that's a nonprofit, the county assessor gives essentially a exemption of property tax for that unit. And so almost all the dedicated affordable housing developments that are built, you know, take advantage of that property tax exemption, but it's not broadly available.
I think pieces like that help, but I think what's going on in the conversation in the city of Oakland around how to fund housing and projects is really where the model should be at. Because at the end of the day, like, it goes back to the red line communities. We have spaces to the, like, basically in Berkeley to the west of MLK that have historically been over policed. They've had like histories of disinvestment, have had long standing, and also in South Berkeley as well too, like long standing times of not investing money into the livelihood of the people who live there. And so instead what we've invested money into is like policing to like oversee whatever they're doing. Like, and I think the model Oakland's doing is saying like, look, like if we just give people the basic things that they need, we solve a lot of other issues. If we invest in human beings, if we invest in like collective consciousness, that's the way we solve all these other crimes, all these other issues. I mean, well, I guess, oh man, I'm speaking too much again, but like when we talk about tax credits versus like taxing, there's no difference between the two of those. Like, it's still the same thing. It's still going to either create more debt for the government, or it's still going to mean our property owners have to pay more. The only thing that is already an existing line item in budgets that currently exist is money we're investing in our militaries and in our policing. If you shift that to be a more positive solution, that is a pool of money that we could be accessing that we're not choosing to do as a city of Berkeley, nor as a country as a whole.
I've got a couple more questions. We still have quite a bit of time. Some really good questions though here. The legislative analyst consistently worries that the governor's programs don't have long-term funding and maybe short-term fixes only. And it says specifically, Professor Galante, Ms. Hossain, please weigh in.
So I think I have a ton of respect for the LAO. They do really good work. And I'm not sure whether this is just overall or on the homelessness issue, but the home key, the new homeless program that came out or is coming out soon by the governor's office does allow some ongoing support. So operating support for these properties and service support for permanently supportive housing. And that has been definitely missing in all the conversation around keeping people housed or getting unsheltered people housed. You can put a lot of money into buying a hotel or building a new permanent supportive housing, but there is not enough money in the system, whether that's coming out of the Medicare programs or Medi-Cal programs or coming out of the housing budgets, like vouchers. There's not enough money in that income support system to deal with all the homeless people that we have. And we really absolutely need that. So that's my view.
And I'll add that this is the very reason why we're advocating at the state level for longer term solutions. And I think this highlights the importance for all of us to be calling our state legislators, for our organizations to be writing and calling the governor's office and legislators, asking for these long-term solutions. I think once they're seeing that these shorter term solutions are working and helping, and they're getting pressure from us that they need to keep continuing these programs and taking, you know, as Xavier said, like, investing in people instead of in the police and the military, like, they can see that this is going to be good for everyone. Like, all of us will benefit when every segment of our community is thriving.
Thank you. Yes. Okay, next question. I have actually two more questions now. Any prediction on numbers of evictions in the pipeline currently waiting for the moratorium to expire? That's a good question. I don't know how we would know that, but
very difficult to get eviction data in California. Some of that is a really good reason because of privacy concerns, but it does make it really hard for policymakers and reporters to get get data on this. So I think, you know, one of the things that, you know, folks have been tracking, I mentioned the National Equity Atlas, and I'll drop a link in, but the census has been doing this household pulse survey, just asking people if they've missed rent payments, if they're behind on rent. Again, you know, the last estimate was 758,000 households in California who are behind on rent, making them eligible for an eviction, depending on their, you know, what sort of protections they have locally. And another thing to look out for is the Carol's colleagues at UC Berkeley at the Urban Displacement Project are preparing to release an eviction risk model, basically, that describes areas around the Bay Area and California where there's the greatest risk of eviction. So it doesn't, it's not a silver ball, but it does provide some information to policymakers in particular about how to direct resources.
Thank you. I want to move on to the next question just because we have so many questions. Now, all of a sudden at the end, of course, everyone's popping in. So has anyone seen data on how rent relief / potential evictions, break down geographically? I think you've just sort of mentioned that a bit. Are certain cities in the Bay Area experiencing this more than others?
So I'll say the biggest factor for that, I mean, this is just true before the pandemic or after the pandemic. When we're negotiating a move-out agreement for a tenant, if they have just cause protections and rent control protections, it is much more effective for us to be able to defend their ability to stay in that place. Because the reality is that if a tenant lives in a city that does not have one of those two things, the owner could just raise the rent to whatever amount they want to. There's some other protections and laws that we would argue like are still in place, but the reality is like, if there's not a state of emergency, if there's not a reason, the state of California can say that like, we need to prevent price gouging, then the owner could like decide to raise the rent from $1,000 to $15,000 a month if they wanted to. We in our legal system tell them that that's your fundamental right to do so. And so it creates a really strong lack of leverage for the tenants to be able to negotiate an ability to stay in those places. And for us, even as tenant rights attorneys, like we don't prioritize those because at the end of the day, like we know we can't really preserve that tenancy. And so I think that's why it's important to like for places that don't have it to get just cause and rent control.
Thank you. Does anyone else want to add to that? Okay, there's a question here. Do we know if there's any evidence of minimum basic income making a difference in reducing the number of unhoused in communities? I'm not sure if that means like raising the income or
I think the question is about there are some experiments going on with universal basic income. When Mayor Tubbs was in Stockton, you know, there was a program going on. There has been evaluation of that and how people spent, you know, the money that they got cash. They didn't get rent subsidy. They got cash and supplemental cash, and they could do with it what they wanted. I actually have not, I don't have maybe Erin has it in her head. I don't have the data in my head from that small experiment. I believe City of Oakland is starting a similar experiment. But globally, I think it's pretty clear that what you do see is people spend the money on things that they need. You know, they're not spending the money frivolously. So if rent is something that they need to spend it on, you know, it may be fixing a car, it may be the rent, but people are not spending it frivolously. So I do think this income support approach certainly makes sense in a lot of situations.
Thank you. Yeah, I think you're totally right. Universal basic income was what the question asker meant. So thank you for addressing that. And yes, they are doing that in Oakland right now, and they're taking applicants from East Oakland. So if anyone's from there or knows folks who are, there's two things that I want to address, and then we are going to wrap up. One question was asked about what is the status of the mortgage moratorium, which I don't know anything about. So I'm curious to see what you all have to say.
So let me just say, I think there's federal forbearance, which is a little different than a moratorium, but I think that's what the questioner, the people are asking. There are periods of time of which, if you have a pandemic induced inability to pay your mortgage, the lender is required to, not force you to make those payments. You do still owe them eventually. The fact is, it's easier under all the work that was done during the last crisis. It is easier actually for lenders to restructure the mortgage so that people can, pay that money when they sell the house, or like some later point in time, and not necessarily wrap it into their current monthly obligations. There are some, I don't want to call them loopholes, I would call them gaps in the system, that not all lenders are subject to that. And California did some special work to try to incentivize lenders that aren't subject to the federal forbearance to get them to do it in California. But they don't have as clear a legal right as the government over these institutions, because they're not regulated appropriately.
And we have seen foreclosures they've definitely been there have been much fewer foreclosures happening in the past year because of this federal forbearance, and because many mortgages are federally backed loans, but because not all of them are, and some people are still getting foreclosed on.
Thank you. The last question is actually for Shajuti. If you could just talk a little bit about, I think that we had some folks who missed the plan, the regional plan that you were talking about. Could you just one more time kind of explain what it is? And folks, we will definitely make sure that we get connected so that we can be involved in that as well. You said there's an advocacy piece, and I'd be curious to learn more about it.
Yeah, definitely. So the regional plan is called the Regional Housing Needs Allocation, and every regional agency in California has to do this every 8 years. So the Bay Area's regional plan is almost done. We have draft allocations, and they'll be final by the end of this year. And basically they're giving housing targets to every city and county in our region across 4 income levels. So at very low, moderate, and above moderate income levels. So I've been advocating a lot on this regional plan to make sure that it follows our legal duty to affirmatively further fair housing, which basically means to actively take steps to address racial segregation. And so at the regional level, we've been advocating to make sure that more affordable housing is targeted in especially the exclusionary suburbs that have historically excluded housing that's affordable. And unfortunately, like disproportionately, it's people who are Black and Latinx who need that affordable housing because of our other systemic racism in the economy. Anyway, so at the regional level, that plan is coming together now, but it funnels into these local housing element plans. And so that's where the local governments are also required to affirmatively further fair housing or address racial segregation. So that's where I think there's a really great opportunity for the league to get involved, or individually, if you're interested, to get involved with your, basically to talk to your local city council members or county supervisors, to talk about the need for affordable housing and investments in neighborhoods of color, especially. So those are all connected. They are also overseen by the state government. So it is meant to be sort of like a comprehensive approach to addressing housing in California. Doesn't always work out, there are always loopholes and gaps that we're trying to fill, but it's also a really great opportunity now that they are all legally required to address fair housing.
Thank you so much for going over that for us and giving us the details a little bit more in depth. I want to say, what I want to do is I'm going to give my sort of final remarks, and then I want you all, so you can take this time to think. It's like, wait, don't tell me, so you have to come up with 2 to 3 things, like solid things that we can do to address the issues that we've been talking about today. One, of course, for me is going to be stay educated and informed about these issues. That's really, for me, always the biggest thing. And for those of you who are not members of the League, we invite you to join us. And if not our Berkeley, Albany, Emeryville League, I know that some of you live or work in other places. There are local leagues all over the Bay Area, all over the state, and all over the country. So definitely we invite you to join your local league. I want to thank so much Elisa Mills, who did the organizing with me and reached out to speakers, and to folks who helped us with, getting everything out onto our website and our Zoom calls and all of the tech that goes behind the event. Thank you so much to all of you. And thank you, of course, to our wonderful panelists who, took the time today to share their information with us and who just generally are involved in something that's so important to our communities. Also, I know Xavier has to hop off because he's got a very important meeting at 7. So I'm going to let you go first with your 2 to 3 things, solid things that we can do to address these issues.
So I think that locally in the city of Berkeley, there's a lot of big policies that are coming up, but I think the main one that we really should focus on is this right of return, specifically as we develop the North and South Berkeley BART stations and get funding to actually adequately provide those things. We have to be very vocal in saying that we need enough funding to undo the harms that have historically happened in our city. Second, I think part of getting that funding is going to require us having the political willpower, both as elected officials and community members, to say, we want to do tax credits, we want to defund our police, defund our military. We have to be united in that conversation. Otherwise, nothing will happen. I say that I can do all the votes that I want to on whatever bodies that I'm on, but at the end of the day, if there's not the support there down the road, even if we pass it, it won't stay there. And the last thing is related to that, which is just anytime there's a budget conversation, just speak on the budget and what its meaning is and what its significance is, because how we spend our money is how we decide everything in our society. That's true of us as individuals, and that's true of us as government organizations. And so those are the things that I would say.
Thank you so much. Whoever wants to go next can go next.
I can go next because my points are related. I'll repeat what I said earlier, is that tell your city council members, your local elected officials, that you want housing and justice in your communities, and ask them to support the policies that Xavier mentioned and to memorialize them in the housing element, because that's where cities and counties commit to passing policies in the next several years. So all of those policies that he mentioned are really key, including any others that you think that you are hearing from your Black and Brown neighbors and community members. Definitely lift those up and tell your city council members to include them in the housing element.
I'll go one step further and say, if you own property, build an ADU and rent it out at an affordable price to your neighbor who is looking for a house, an affordable place to live. There's streamlined rules for ADUs, so it's not necessarily easier, but it should be, and they're more affordable to build than other things. And if you have, other excess space, consider allowing your neighbor to share that space with you.
So I would just, I think everybody said it all. The only thing I would add, because I agree with a lot of what has been said, is there was a tremendous effort last year to get regional authority in the Bay Area at the state level to generate funding and more regional cooperation in how we solve this problem. And I'm very optimistic and excited about that authority, but I would ask, and I know there's a number of elected officials on the phone, to really engage with these issues at the regional level, because when you think about infrastructure and transportation and where jobs are, housing, it's a regional issue, and it's got to be, we've got to have some, back to the point of the regional plan, we've got to have, regional strategies, not just local strategies. Not that we don't need local strategies too.
Thank you. I know that Xavier has his rent stabilization board meeting, so that's why he had to leave. But thank you again so much for being here, and thank you to our audience for your great questions and your curiosity and, you know, your desire to learn more. I think that that's so valuable, just our openness to learning about these issues. I've learned a lot and really appreciate your time. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Got our virtual clapping.
For having us.
Feel free to unmute if you want to clap. You know, we can do real clapping if you want.